I got an emergency disaster warning at school. Part 2. Written by HHeyPeter. To my surprise, the hallway looked completely untouched from the storm that had happened inside the classroom. The lockers retained both their symmetry and their locations, remaining firmly implanted in the ground. I was confused. Why did the wind only affect the classroom? The window wasn't open in the class, so how did the storm even get in? I began looking around the hallway, closely examining the environment for some potential evidence of the storm. The lockers looked brand new. Not a dent, scuff, or scratch to be seen on the entire row. Next, I checked the floor. Aside from a few dust piles huddled into the corner beside a new water fountain, the floor looked spick and span. The walls looked just as they did beforehand, chipped eggshell yellow paint and malformed brick foundation. I turned to face the door and noticed something on the wall to the left of it. It looked like several small holes had been drilled into the wall, about 15 centimeters apart. They looked far too precise and deliberate to match the general wear that the walls have. I crouched down to try to look inside the holes, and I found that the holes were deep enough to penetrate the entire wall and give me a glance at the class. I could see Philippe trying to look comfortable while sitting on top of a desk, his concerned expression betraying him. Why would someone drill holes in the wall? How did they do it? I kept these questions fresh in my mind as I began to search for Mr. Sammon. The hallways were just as vacant as when I got there. Not a soul in sight. My footsteps echoed in an eerie, lonely way with every step I took. It felt like it didn't matter how many people were inside the school. I was totally alone. I made a beeline towards the main office to check if he was there. Peering through the glass, I noticed that Mr. Sammon wasn't there, nor was the receptionist. I assumed that she's hiding in her office to comply with the disaster warning over the intercom. And sure enough, the office door was locked. I knocked a couple of times on the door, but I got no response. "Excuse me, is there anyone there? I'm Jamie from Mr. Sammon's math class, and he hasn't returned in 10 minutes. And the disaster warning told us to stay in an enclosed room. Is he in here?" I asked, hoping to get a reply. No one responded, so I knocked again. I let out a frustrated sigh, knowing that I've got nowhere in finding him. I decided to give up on finding anyone in the office and went to scouring the hallways, knocking on other classroom doors and calling his name. I open the first door I see, and it's empty. The second is identical. After the third, fourth, and fifth door, I start to worry. Where is he? Where is everyone? Most kids didn't go to summer school, but I hoped that I could see even a few kids. Philippe and Nahil were the only other students I knew who were at the school. Where were the others? I could have this question answered if the receptionist wasn't hiding in the office, but she was no luck. I began to rack my brain for a solution. So, the classrooms were a bust, and calling Mr. Sammon's name got me nowhere. What am I supposed to do? I was already committed to my goal, and I couldn't go back in failure. So, with a stoic face, I marched deeper into the hallway, into another wing to continue my search. The sound of an awful squelch came from the floor as I walked, making me stop in my tracks. I looked down to my shoes and prayed that I hadn't stepped on old gum. I always hated when people would be so lazy as to throw their gum on the ground rather than throwing it out like a normal person. It's so gross. I reluctantly lifted my left shoes and saw a massive glob of beige gum stuck to it, wide enough to nearly overlap the bottom of my shoe and wrap around the sides. I cringed and hopped towards a nearby garbage can, scraping my foot against the side to peel the gum off. Thankfully, it offered little resistance and flopped into the can, falling in one solid mass. How could gum get so big? It was nearly as big as my foot, so obviously it can't fit in someone's mouth. Did someone keep chewing gum for years and discard every single wad into one disgusting glob and then put it on the floor for some poor sap to step on? Which I did. I heard a similar sound of squelching, but from further down in the hallway. Curious, I kept my ears peeled to see if I could hear the sound again, and my curiosity was rewarded with another squelch, and it was closely followed by a crunch. I assumed the squelch was the gum again, but I was clueless as to what the crunch sound came from. Both sounds were soft and sounded almost muffled, like it was being blocked by something. I walked towards the sounds that were leading me down the hallway and into Class 2.5, an old classroom located near a bathroom. All the way I walked there, I kept spotting similar bunches of gum like the one I had stepped on. They were stuck on the floor and on the wall. Some even were on the ceiling. I closely examined a particularly nasty spot on the wall, and I got a noseful of foul scent. I recoiled and plugged my nose, the scent of rotting fruit and paint invading my nose. I wasn't too familiar with gum, but I knew that it wasn't supposed to smell like decay. Even the cheapest gum could still retain a fresh, fruity smell once it was chewed. But this smell almost had an artificial quality to it, like it had been made to smell that way, rather than the scent being an inherent quality of the gum. I noticed all the cracks and fissures in the thinly stretched candy smear and came to a conclusion. This wasn't candy at all. It was plaster. It all started to come together. The strange smell, the odd locations of its placement and its abundance. Someone just gave the school an awful plaster coating. I felt satisfied with my answer and continued to follow the sounds. The squishes and crunches became violent snaps and muddy-sounding squashes. It almost sounded like someone was trying to break apart a chicken with their bare hands. I went to open the door, but the doorknob didn't move when I went to turn it. I peered into the small rectangular window to see if anyone was inside, and my heart immediately dropped. A male student was sprawled out on the floor, clearly unconscious. A macabre wound slashed across his chest, tearing his shirt open and leaving a gruesome crevasse that looked severe enough to break his ribs and expose his respiratory system. An enormous puddle of blood pooled around his body, snaking around the legs of various desks and spreading across his body with a thick viscosity. There was a body in that classroom. I felt my knees buckle and my legs go stiff. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to open the door with all my might. It felt like the door wasn't locked, but jammed from the inside. I started pounding on the door fiercely. "Are you okay?" I exclaimed, trying to, in some vain attempt, see if he could hear me. The body stayed motionless. But I heard something moving inside. I wanted to step away from the door and try to bust the glass open to open the door, but my legs were stuck in place. I was paralyzed in shock. I was stuck. My breathing became panicked gasps and my body began to tremble. I tried to form my hands into fists to punch the glass in desperation, but they were trembling so much that I could hardly even move them without them searing in pain. Dreadful memories of the past filled my head, making my morale plummet even more than it already was. I knew exactly what was going on. I was failing to save this kid. My heart felt like it had hit an all-time abysmal low, and I thoroughly deserved it. I was so much of a coward that I couldn't even open this door. My breaths became labored and my heart hurt with every thump. Useless. I'm utterly useless. I should have just stayed in class. Trying to go out and be brave was clearly not working. No, I won't let this happen. I won't. I have fallen into deep, deep depressions before, but I can't falter now. There is someone I can save, and I won't let them die because of my cowardice. I forced myself to grit my teeth and to try summoning any remaining strength from my twitching body and clenched my fist as hard as possible. I could feel my wrist getting sore from my trembling, but I did my best to ignore the pain. I clenched my thighs and quads to stabilize my legs and swung my fist quickly, shattering the glass. I felt the pricks into my fist as the glass shards jabbed me, my blood leaking from the holes with the speed of molasses. But that didn't matter. I thrust my arm through the now empty space and grabbed the doorknob, twisting and pulling with all my might. I nearly tore out the knob when I heard a thunk and shoved the door open, sprinting into the room. As soon as I entered, I found what was making all that noise. A monstrous sphere of writhing, decomposing human arms and legs sat in the corner, squishing and squashing as the arms flailed around and pulled at the seemingly gelatinous, bubbling blob that encased them, as if they were desperate for escape. Every scratch or pull the arms made were quickly sealed by a solvent-like opaque fluid that trapped them, making the arms fluctuate between clawing for dear life and being sealed in the almost fleshy ball of paint. I saw no other body parts, no eyes, ears, or any sort of face or hair. Just arms and legs, human limbs. Each limb looked like it was randomly dispersed through the body, with no care to put legs to any sort of bottom to this thing. The simplest way I could describe this monster is a ball of Play-Doh with arms and legs of dolls haphazardly stuck wherever, with no discernible pattern. The shock of seeing this abomination was utterly ghastly to look at. I could hear the limbs pop out and recede back into the flesh with a gurgle and a pop like a thick, pus-filled boil bursting. I was astonished, completely taken off balance. What on God's green earth is this thing? I couldn't even begin to rationalize what this thing is. It clearly isn't a person. How did this creature even come to be? I was drawing nothing but blanks in my mind, and I don't think I wanted to know where this thing came from. I felt my stomach groan and bile churn inside, but I just exhaled and tiptoed towards the collapsed boy. The pain in my hand really started to get acute, but I still kept going. Finally, I got close enough to scoop the boy into my arms and carry him, doing my best not to alert the monster in the room. Thankfully, I could still feel a pulse, and he still exuded body heat, meaning that he was still alive. I breathed a heavy sigh of relief. He wasn't very heavy, but it felt so much more stressful and challenging to carry over 100 extra pounds while trying to be stealthy. I slinked towards the door, avoiding the blood pool and stepping around the desks. I heard the sound of a palm striking something moist, followed quickly by a loud snap. Presumably, that arm's bones snapping as it got consumed. A horrifying question struck me. Where did the rest of this class go? There was only one kid here, and this monster. It took me a second to think, but the answer hit me like a speeding bullet. A coarse, peeling sound erupted from the back of the room, catching my attention. The monster picked itself up off the floor and stood up, countless legs and outstretched arms supporting its massive body. It didn't have any eyes, but I could tell that it was looking directly at me, and it wasn't happy. I froze in place, unsure if I should run or slowly creep towards the door. I didn't have to form an answer on my own because that thing lunged at me and looked like it wanted to sprint. I bolted from the door, carrying the body bridal style, and hearing the wet flops and smacks of flesh against the floor. The sounds of bones snapping and contorting as the beast barreled towards me, carelessly breaking its limbs in pure ecstasy as it chased me. I glanced behind me and saw that this monster was rolling after me. Broken, floppy arms and legs feverishly clawing and pulling the massive body towards me at a startlingly fast speed. I was running on pure adrenaline and instinct, desperate for an escape method. I wasn't a slow runner by any means, but this thing was extraordinarily fast, despite everything about its anatomy suggesting that it wasn't. I was running out of this corridor, and turning around to hang a left or a right would almost undoubtedly get me caught. So I charged into the men's bathroom in desperation, leaning my back against the door in case it tried to open it. I felt the thumbs of the hands banging on the door and the vibrations that it caused. Either it wasn't aware of the door handle or it wasn't capable of opening the door. Regardless, I was thankful. The monster continued its onslaught and I clutched the body. I spied a small first aid kit attached to the wall near the dirty bathroom mirror on Velcro, and I thanked my lucky stars. I wasn't exactly a trained professional, but I thought that I might be able to patch up this kid's wound the best that I could and fix the glass shards in my own hand. The only problem was that the door was still being hounded by that monster, so I was trapped inside. That announcement said that emergency services were coming to the school, right? If the cops come, they might have enough firepower to deal with this thing. I found myself with a choice. I had to either stop pressing my back against the door and grab the kit, which risks the monster getting inside, or I can keep the door shut, risking both me and the kid bleeding out. I never heard the knob rustle, so I don't think that the monster knew how to get inside. After carefully considering both options, I sighed a shaky breath and I made my choice. Cautiously, I stood up and I marched towards the kit, hearing the door rumbling much more dramatically now that I wasn't pressing my weight against it. I heard the wood of the door scrape against the door frame, a sound that made me fear the door being knocked off its hinges. I lay down the boy in my arms as gently as I could onto the floor, and I saw how much blood I had soaked into my shirt. Before I attempted to patch this kid up, I was in desperate need to piss. I go to the open stall closest to me, but it was locked shut. I tried the next one, but it was similarly locked. Frustrated, I got desperate and crawled underneath the stall to reach the toilet, only to find something sitting on it. It looked like a doll made to resemble a SWAT uniform composed entirely out of black coaxial cables, measuring around 2 meters. The wires looked like they had no binding agent, so they were just tied together so fiercely that they couldn't even pull apart. It made a disturbingly accurate, picturesque resemblance to an actual human being's anatomy. It almost looked sculpted. The limbs were proportional. Chest and shoulder were well defined with a head on top. A square jaw with half of a modern soldier's helm composed of hard black plastic. Peering closer, I could see tiny wires bent together into small square shapes to resemble teeth. Strung out cords were made to look like makeshift hands and feet, and on its back looked like one of those giant air conditioners that you find on the wall in a cheap motel room. A giant, white, moldy box full of scratches that would have hissed air that was either too cold or too hot. But it looked to be inoperable. In fact, the whole doll had that out-of-commission look to it. It was slumped against the toilet in a bathroom stall, with no visible mark of ownership. I was baffled. Who would leave such a well-made but bizarre doll lying in the bathroom? A substantial pound from the limb of the monster outside caused the whole stall to shake, making the doll slump to the side of the stall, exposing a dripping black liquid coming from what looked to be its abdomen. I inspected it closer and found a slash in its chest, a precise hole that dripped a black liquid onto the bathroom floor. A quick whiff told me everything that I needed to know. It was oil. I began to reconsider dubbing this thing a doll. Dolls weren't filled with fluids like this, especially if it's meant to resemble blood. Dragging against the ground by a forming oil puddle were little tendril-like wires with slender drill bits on the ends, coated in a thick residue. Upon seeing them, I instantly thought back to the small set of holes in Sammon's classroom wall, and the gears in my head started to turn. It was a ridiculous thought, but the impossible seemed to be real. There was a Play-Doh monster outside the door waiting to chase me after all. Did this doll drill those holes? I tried to think of a plausible method as to how it could have done that. Either someone lifted it or used those bits manually. Or is this thing another monster? The hole in its chest and the leaking oil meant to be blood probably meant that this thing got stabbed, so did someone hide the body here? Who would even stab this thing? I recall hearing something scream in the hallway when I was still in the class, followed by metal scratching metal. So that could have been when this thing got stabbed. It made sense to me, but someone would have had to have stabbed this thing and carried it across the hallway, without leaving any oil drops and just dropping it off in the stall nonchalantly. I haven't seen anyone else here, so who could have done it? Sammon? I slapped my forehead with my good hand in frustration, realizing that I'm no closer to my original goal to find my teacher. It wasn't all bad though. I got to carry someone to safety and get chased by a monster, and find a dead monster in a bathroom stall. If anything, it'll be a story to tell Nahil and Philippe. I crawl underneath the monster corpse stall, going to the next stall, which thankfully was vacant. Unfastening my pants and my undergarments, I sat down on the cold toilet bowl and relieved myself. It was a little difficult to piss when an ungodly monster is banging outside the bathroom, but I still managed to do it. Once I finished, I heard the banging come to a halt and stop entirely. The sound of palms smacking against the floor came from outside, but slowly grew distant from me, as if the monster was rolling away from the door. Hopefully, the monster was too tired to chase after its crafty prey and gave up. But the thought of that monster being on the loose in the hallway was overwhelming. Just as I flushed the toilet and fastened my pants back up, the sound of metal that I heard a little while ago rang out again, this time being swallowed by the disturbing noise of flesh squishing. I heard an enormous plop on the ground. It sounded like wet meat hitting the ground with considerable speed. I couldn't believe my ears. Did that monster just die right outside the bathroom? The metal sound rang again, swiftly followed by a soft shink. The sound of steel-toed boots against the ground came from outside, then the sounds of squirts coming from what I assumed to be a spray bottle. Someone swore from outside. Someone was outside. They were too far away for me to really recognize their voice, but at least that meant that someone else is alive. I hoped desperately that it was Mr. Sammon. The boot sounds rapidly approached the door, like whoever was coming was in a rush. "Shouldn't have left that thing in a stall," the voice said again, this time much more legible. It sounded like it came from an old Chinese man with a hint of jovialness in his tone. From the way that he said "thing," I could tell that he was talking about the wire monster. So, this guy was definitely not Mr. Sammon and is most likely the guy who put the monster in the stall next to me. He suddenly kicked the bathroom door open, and I felt a rapid surge of discomfort. I had no idea who this guy was or how he managed to presumably kill those monsters. If he was able to kill 2 monsters so quickly without breaking a sweat, then who is this guy? I struggled to imagine anyone I knew in the school who could so easily dispatch something of such an esoteric caliber. Was he someone meant to search for us? The disaster message did mention emergency services coming to our aid, but I didn't expect them to come so quickly. The voice swore again. I saw the boots rush over to the unconscious kid that I left on the floor and crouch down. I wasn't able to see much of this man, but I saw that his boots looked like a cross between the boots a soldier would wear and some type of eccentric boots that a glam rocker would wear. The tight laces and slim design just screamed military, but the amount of glittering buckles and belts looked far too flashy for any sane military branch to supply someone with. I heard a grunt as the boy was lifted off the ground. The man stood up again. My heart jumped. Where was he taking him? I heard the snapping of metal from the stall next to me. The stall door creaked open. The man heaved the dead monster over his shoulder like it was nothing. Why did he want that monster? Where is he taking it? These questions swirled around in my mind, but they were cut off by something dropping onto the floor. A massive, sheathed blade, as thick as a tree clattered to the ground, sounding like a gong once it hit the floor. I couldn't tell you what kind of sword it was, but it looked too large to be a katana, but I saw it had a similarly curved blade. The hilt had small brown stains speckled about it, clearly bloodstains. I was at a complete loss for words. Not only did this guy just slaughter a monster without breaking a sweat, he's armed with a sword. I thought this guy was a cop or something. Why is he carrying a sword? I heard him grunt and crouch down to reach his gargantuan blade and place it back on his side, clicking it into place on his belt. He kicked the door open and left with the injured student and the monster corp, leaving me completely alone. "Hey, gotta take care of this kid here. Go search for other survivors," he said from outside, seemingly unfazed by the fact that he was holding an injured child in his arms. I assumed that someone from emergency services had come, but I didn't hear them respond. The way he casually mentioned survivors made a chill run down my spine. His tone cut a clear picture in my mind of the state of the school. They had to specifically look for survivors rather than see if everyone was okay. I honestly wasn't sure how to react. How long was I gone for? I reached into my pocket to pull out my phone and check the time and saw that it was 9:34 a.m. I've only been gone for an hour and a half, but it felt like a lifetime. The emergency services were already here, but I still wanted to call 911 just to be safe. I dialed the number with my good hand and put my phone to my ear, but the only response I got was static. I guess the lines are still down. I let out a small curse and put my phone back. I quietly opened the stall door and looked around at the empty bathroom. Even if the injured kid and monster corpse were the only ones in here, I still felt like I had some form of company. But now I'm totally alone. I felt a sense of pride that I was able to escort the injured student from that monster. Hopefully, the emergency services would aid him better than I could. I couldn't hear anyone talking outside, so I assumed the man had left with the kid. Curiously, he left the first aid kit right on the wall. I hoped that it was because someone with actual medical training had better equipment to aid the kid, which was a step up from what would have been my haphazard, one-handed attempt to try and patch his wound. Since I was alone with the kit, I quickly got to work plucking the glass shards out of my hand. Each tiny shard gave me an acute stab of pain that made me wince when I pulled the shard out. Thankfully, my hand wasn't too busted up, and the shards were large enough for me to take out with one hand. Each shard clanked to the ground, and I wrapped my hand in gauze. My left hand looked like a mummified oven mitt, but I could cope with it. I wasn't sure what to do next. I should probably keep looking for Mr. Sammon, or maybe I should check up on Nahil and Philippe. I knew I had to tell them both about the monster encounters, but I didn't know exactly how to go about it. I could tell them the whole story, but whether or not they would believe me was up in the air. I still felt uncomfortable around these emergency services folk, but they could probably explain it better than I could. Suddenly, the lights in the bathroom flickered rapidly and then shut off. What I assumed to be a light bulb cracked, leaving me in the darkness. I was still stuck on choosing whether to look for Mr. Sammon or find my two friends, but I didn't want to stay in the dark. I pushed the door open and I saw no one outside. I reached into my wallet, I took out a dime, and I flipped it. Heads for Mr. Sammon and tails for my classmates. The coin landed on my good palm and came up tails. I put the coin back into my pocket and headed back to my classroom, prepared to go and find my friends.